The clinking of fine glassware and the soft hum of conversation filled the elegant dining hall of La Toile, a restaurant known for its exclusivity and sky-high prices. It was a place where the city's elite came to see and be seen, and tonight was no exception. Beneath the warm glow of golden chandeliers, a group of well-dressed businessmen occupied the largest table in the room, their laughter rising above the ambient noise. At the center of the table sat Jonathan Price, a self-made millionaire whose name alone could open doors and close deals. But his charm, much like his wealth, often came with sharp edges. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of Bordeaux as his companions hung on his every word. His anecdotes, mostly stories of triumphs in business and exploits on lavish vacations, were the fuel for their amusement. The more they laughed, the broader his grin grew. He thrived on attention, and tonight, he was the undisputed king of the table. "Can you believe this place?" Jonathan said, gesturing toward the room with his glass. "They charge you a fortune for a meal, and yet the service? Barely mediocre." His friends chuckled, nodding in agreement. Maybe if they spent half as much time training their staff as they do polishing the silverware, we wouldn't have to wait so long for a refill. At that moment, Sarah Michaels, one of the restaurant's waitresses, approached the table. She carried a tray with the practiced ease of someone who had worked in the industry for years. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, but her eyes held a weariness that couldn't be hidden. It had been a long shift, and Jonathan's table had been one of the most demanding. "Good evening, gentlemen," Sarah said politely, setting down their entrees with care. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" Jonathan glanced at her, a smirk playing on his lips. "How about a smile, sweetheart? You look like you've been working at a funeral parlor." His friends burst into laughter, their amusement echoing through the room. Sarah froze for a fraction of a second, her hand tightening around the edge of the tray. She was no stranger to rude comments. Working in a high-end restaurant often meant dealing with entitled patrons, but something about Jonathan's tone, the way he looked at her like she was less than human, struck a nerve. She straightened her back and forced a polite smile. "I'll check on your drinks," she said, her voice steady but cool, before turning to leave. Jonathan wasn't done. "You know, Sarah," he called after her, reading her name tag, as if it gave him permission to address her like an old acquaintance. "Maybe if you smiled more, you'd get better tips. Or, who knows, maybe even a promotion." His table erupted in laughter again, their voices carrying across the restaurant. Other patrons glanced over, their expressions ranging from discomfort to mild curiosity. Sarah kept walking, disappearing into the kitchen without looking back. In the relative quiet of the kitchen, Sarah leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The sting of Jonathan's words lingered, but she wasn't about to let him see that he'd gotten to her. "Just a few more hours," she muttered to herself. "You've dealt with worse." But this wasn't just about Jonathan. Sarah's life was a juggling act of responsibilities and aspirations. The job at La Toile was a means to an end, a way to pay the bills while she worked toward her master's degree in social work. Her goal was to help underprivileged youth, to create opportunities for kids who, like her, had grown up with the odds stacked against them. Every tray she carried, every insult she endured, brought her one step closer to that dream. Back in the dining hall, Jonathan's table was still buzzing with energy. One of his friends leaned over. "You really have a way with people, Price," he said, raising his glass in mock salute. "Always the charmer." Jonathan shrugged, his grin never faltering. "Hey, I call it like I see it. If she can't handle a little banter, she's in the wrong business." But as the night wore on, even Jonathan couldn't ignore the occasional glances from other diners. Not everyone found his behavior entertaining. A couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, their eyes flicking toward him before quickly looking away. A waiter passing by shot him a disapproving glance, though he said nothing. For a man who prided himself on controlling the room, The subtle signs of judgment were unsettling. Sarah returned to the table, her professional mask firmly in place. She refilled their glasses and cleared empty plates, ignoring Jonathan's attempts to bait her with more comments. When one of his friends tried to join in, she cut him off with a polite but firm, "Is there anything else I can assist you with, sir?" The man blinked, clearly caught off guard by her tone. No, that's all." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, watching her retreat to the kitchen once more. There was something about her that intrigued him. Not her appearance or demeanor, but the quiet strength she exuded, even in the face of his mockery. He didn't like it. Jonathan was used to people bending, catering to his whims. Sarah's refusal to do so, even subtly, felt like a challenge. As the evening wound down, Jonathan's table grew quieter, the conversations lulling as the effects of the wine set in. Sarah continued her rounds, her interactions with other tables noticeably warmer, even genuine. She laughed at a joke from an older couple and offered a thoughtful wine recommendation to another group. Her professionalism never wavered, but it was clear that her treatment of Jonathan's table was deliberate. When the check finally arrived, Jonathan reached for it with a flourish, pulling out his black card. "Gentlemen, this one's on me," he announced, flashing the card like a trophy. His friends cheered, raising their glasses in a final toast. As Sarah approached to collect the bill, Jonathan leaned back, smirking. "Well, Sarah, it's been a pleasure. Maybe next time, you'll bring your A game." Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she gave him a measured look, one that conveyed more than words ever could. Without breaking eye contact, she replied, "Have a good night, Mr. Price." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him with the unsettling feeling that he hadn't had the last word after all. As the table cleared out, Jonathan remained seated for a moment, his friends heading toward the exit. He glanced toward the kitchen, half expecting Sarah to appear again. But she didn't. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, shame. It was a feeling he couldn't quite name, and one he wasn't sure he wanted to confront. The warm glow of the chandeliers dimmed in Sarah's mind as she stood behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, her back pressed against the cold metal counter. Her heart pounded, her fingers gripping the edge of a tray she wasn't even sure she'd use. Jonathan Price's words rang in her ears, his mocking tone like a persistent echo she couldn't shake. She had dealt with difficult customers before, entitled, rude, and dismissive. But something about tonight felt different. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he laughed at her, the way his friends joined in, as if her existence was nothing more than the punchline to their jokes. Sarah exhaled sharply, forcing herself to calm down. The night was almost over. She had faced worse, hadn't she? Yet a part of her was tired of swallowing her pride, of smiling through the humiliation, of pretending the comments didn't sting. Tonight, she wasn't sure she could let it slide. The sound of her name snapped her out of her thoughts. "Sarah," one of her coworkers called, her voice low but urgent. "Table 8 is asking for you again." Sarah's stomach tightened. Table 8. Jonathan's table. She glanced toward the dining hall through the small circular window on the kitchen door. There he was, leaning back in his chair, his signature smirk firmly in place as he gestured animatedly to his companions. He looked completely unbothered, as if the world existed solely for his amusement. "Great," Sarah muttered under her breath. She wiped her hands on her apron and forced herself to step back onto the floor. Her heels clicked against the polished tiles as she approached the table, her movements deliberate. This time, she wasn't going to walk away quietly. Jonathan noticed her approach before she even reached the table. His smirk widened as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Ah, Sarah," he drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "We were just talking about you. Tell me, how does someone end up working in a place like this? A little too much partying in college, perhaps." The men at the table chuckled, their laughter grating against Sarah's composure. She stopped beside Jonathan's chair, her tray held tightly against her side. Her voice was calm, measured. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Price?" Jonathan tilted his head, feigning thoughtfulness. "Help? Well, now that you mention it, maybe you could tell us how it feels to serve people who are actually going places in life." The table erupted into laughter again, but this time it felt different. The noise was louder, more forced, as if the men were trying to outdo one another in their cruelty. A few nearby tables turned to watch, their curiosity tinged with discomfort. Sarah's grip on the tray tightened, her knuckles turning white. For a moment, she considered walking away, retreating to the safety of the kitchen. But something inside her refused to back down. Slowly, she placed the tray on the edge of the table and straightened her posture. "Mr. Price," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I've worked here for 3 years. I've seen all kinds of people walk through those doors, some kind, some demanding, and some who think their wealth makes them better than everyone else." Jonathan's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly masked it with a raised eyebrow. "And which category do I fall into?" Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "You tell me," she replied, "because from where I'm standing, it seems like you think treating people with dignity is beneath you. But let me tell you something, Mr. Price. Respect isn't a privilege reserved for the wealthy. It's a basic human decency." The table fell silent, the men exchanging uneasy glances. Jonathan's smirk was gone now, replaced by a look of mild surprise. Sarah continued, her voice unwavering. "You asked me how it feels to serve people like you. Well, it's a job, just like any other. But the difference is I don't let it define me. I know who I am, and I don't need anyone's approval to feel worthy." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were trying to read her, to find a crack in her composure. "You've got quite the attitude for someone in your position," he said finally. Sarah's lips curved into a small, resolute smile. "And you've got quite the arrogance for someone in yours," she shot back. "But the difference is I can walk out of here with my head held high, knowing I earned every penny of my paycheck with hard work and integrity. Can you say the same about the way you've earned your fortune?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The nearby diners who had been pretending not to listen now openly stared, their expressions a mix of shock and admiration. Even Jonathan's friends, who had been laughing moments ago, now looked down at their drinks, avoiding his gaze. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. For the first time that night, he was at a loss for words. Sarah took a step back, her posture still straight, her gaze unwavering. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," she said simply, turning on her heel and walking away. As she disappeared into the kitchen, a hush fell over the table. One of Jonathan's friends cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well," he said, forcing a laugh, "that was something." Jonathan didn't respond. He stared at the empty space where Sarah had stood, a strange feeling creeping over him. It wasn't anger or embarrassment. It was something deeper, something unsettling. For years, he had prided himself on being untouchable, on having the upper hand in every interaction. But tonight, a waitress had managed to strip away his facade with a few well-placed words. Back in the kitchen, Sarah leaned against the counter, her hands trembling slightly. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving her both exhilarated and anxious. She glanced at her coworkers, who stared at her with wide eyes. "Did you really just—" one of them began, trailing off. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I did." As she clocked out that night, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what the consequences of her actions might be. She knew she had taken a risk, speaking out against a man as powerful as Jonathan Price. But as she stepped into the cool night air, a sense of calm washed over her. She had stood up for herself, for her dignity, and that was something no one could take away. The sun had barely risen when Jonathan Price woke up in his sprawling penthouse overlooking the city. Normally, his mornings started with a curated routine, a quick workout, a gourmet breakfast prepared by his private chef, and a barrage of emails detailing the latest market trends. But today was different. He hadn't slept well, his mind refusing to let go of what had happened the night before. Jonathan rubbed his temples as he sat on the edge of his king-sized bed. Sarah Michaels. Her words had struck a nerve he hadn't known existed. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, with a calm confidence that made him feel small despite his wealth and power. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. He wandered into the kitchen, where his assistant Andrew was already waiting with a tablet in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Price. Your 9 a.m. call with the Hong Kong investors has been moved up. I also need your approval on the revised." "Not now," Jonathan interrupted, pouring himself a cup of black coffee. His tone lacked its usual sharpness. Andrew glanced at him, puzzled but wise enough not to press further. As Jonathan sipped his coffee, he found his gaze drifting toward the city skyline. His empire, built on strategic deals and relentless ambition, was a testament to his success. Yet, for all his achievements, the satisfaction he usually felt seemed out of reach. Sarah's voice echoed in his mind. Respect isn't a privilege reserved for the wealthy. It's a basic human decency. By mid-morning, Jonathan's frustration had grown unbearable. Unable to focus, he picked up his phone and dialed Andrew. "I want you to find out everything you can about Sarah Michaels," he ordered. "Her background, her family, why she's working at that restaurant. I want details by the end of the day." Andrew hesitated on the other end of the line. "Sir, may I ask why?" "No, you may not," Jonathan snapped, his patience fraying. "Just do it." Across town, Sarah was waking up to a different kind of morning. Her one-bedroom apartment was a stark contrast to Jonathan's penthouse, but it was a space she had earned through sheer determination. Sunlight filtered through the worn curtains as she sat at her small kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through her laptop. Last night's events replayed in her mind, but instead of regret, she felt a quiet sense of pride. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Mia, her best friend. "You're officially a legend. Everyone at work is talking about how you shut Jonathan Price down. I wish I'd seen it." Sarah smiled faintly, but didn't respond. She wasn't looking for applause or validation. What mattered to her was standing up for herself, something she had promised she'd always do after years of being overlooked and underestimated. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what, if anything, Jonathan Price would do next. Later that day, Jonathan sat in his office, a sleek, minimalist space that reflected his persona. Andrew walked in, a folder in hand. "Here's everything we could find on Sarah Michaels," he said, setting it on the desk. Jonathan opened the folder, scanning its contents. Sarah's life unfolded before him in neat bullet points and photocopied documents. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood, she had excelled in school despite financial hardships. Her mother's battle with a chronic illness had forced Sarah to take on multiple jobs to support her family, yet she had managed to graduate with honors. Now, she was pursuing a master's degree in social work, funding her education through her job at Latoil. As Jonathan read, a strange mix of admiration and discomfort washed over him. Here was someone who had faced real challenges, far beyond anything he had ever experienced, and yet she carried herself with dignity and purpose. Her work at the restaurant wasn't a reflection of failure, as he had assumed, but of resilience. Andrew interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, should I prepare a response? Perhaps a gesture of goodwill? A donation to the restaurant in her name, maybe?" Jonathan shook his head. "No, that's not what this is about." He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. For once, he didn't have a clear plan. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore the impact Sarah had made on him. Meanwhile, Sarah's day was filled with her usual routine: studying, working on her thesis, and preparing for her next shift. But as she walked to the restaurant that evening, she noticed something unusual. A sleek black car was parked outside, and the unmistakable figure of Jonathan Price stood near the entrance, checking his watch. Her heart skipped a beat. What was he doing here? Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and approached him. "Mr. Price," she said, her tone cautious. "Did you forget something?" Jonathan turned, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he said, nodding. "I came to talk." She raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "I thought you said everything you needed to say last night." Jonathan hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. "You were right," he admitted finally. "About respect, about decency. I've built my life on thinking those things didn't matter. But last night, you made me realize how wrong I was." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by his admission. "And what do you expect me to do with that, Mr. Price?" "I don't expect anything," Jonathan said. "I just wanted to apologize. And I want to help." "Help?" Sarah repeated, her skepticism evident. "Why would someone like you want to help someone like me?" Jonathan met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because you're not just someone like you. You're someone who's fighting for something bigger than yourself. And I think I could learn a thing or two from you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The bustling sounds of the city filled the silence between them. Finally, Sarah sighed. "If you're serious about helping, it's going to take more than words or money. You'll have to prove it." Jonathan nodded. "Then I'll prove it." As Sarah walked into the restaurant, leaving him standing outside, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Determination, not for profit or success, but for redemption. For the first time, he saw a path forward, not to gain, but to give. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled Jonathan's penthouse as he stared out at the sprawling city below. The usual view, his kingdom, as he liked to call it, felt different today. He had spent years convincing himself that his wealth was a shield, protecting him from the world's judgments. But now, for the first time, that shield felt like a prison. Sarah Michaels had pierced through his carefully constructed facade, and he couldn't stop replaying her words in his mind. Respect wasn't a privilege. It was a right. The concept was so simple, yet it had evaded him for years. Jonathan sat down at his marble dining table, a manila folder lying in front of him. It was the same folder his assistant Andrew had given him, detailing Sarah's life. Her struggles, her achievements, her ambitions. It was all laid out in neat, clinical notes. But as Jonathan flipped through the pages again, the cold facts transformed into something more. They became a story, her story. And for the first time, he saw her not as a waitress or an opponent in a verbal sparring match, but as a person whose life was a testament to perseverance. "Andrew," Jonathan called out, his voice echoing through the penthouse. Moments later, his assistant appeared, tablet in hand. "Yes, Mr. Price." Jonathan gestured toward the folder. "I want you to do something for me. Find out what she needs. Tuition, medical expenses, anything. And I want it handled quietly." Andrew hesitated. "Handled how, sir? Are you planning to?" "Just do it," Jonathan said firmly, cutting him off. "And make it discreet." Later that day, Sarah was on her lunch break, seated at the small cafe near her apartment. She was halfway through her sandwich when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, and she frowned as she answered. "Hello." "Miss Michaels," a professional-sounding voice said on the other end. "My name is Richard Harris. I'm a representative of the Price Foundation." Sarah's brows furrowed. "The what?" "The Price Foundation," Richard repeated. "It's a private philanthropic organization, and we've recently learned about your academic pursuits and financial situation. Mr. Price would like to offer you a scholarship to cover the remainder of your tuition and provide additional support for your educational goals." Sarah sat back in her chair, stunned. "You're joking." "I assure you, Miss Michaels, "This is a genuine offer," Richard said smoothly. "There are no strings attached. All we need is your agreement, and the funds will be transferred immediately." Her grip on the phone tightened as a wave of emotions crashed over her. Shock, confusion, and most of all, anger. No strings attached? Right. Because people like Jonathan Price do things out of the goodness of their hearts. "Miss Michaels," Richard began, but Sarah cut him off. "Tell Mr. Price I'm not for sale," she said coldly before hanging up. Her appetite gone, she tossed her sandwich aside and left the cafe, her thoughts a storm of frustration and disbelief. Back at the penthouse, Jonathan was reviewing documents when Andrew walked in, looking uneasy. "Sir, we have a problem." Jonathan glanced up. "What now?" "It's about the scholarship offer," Andrew said carefully. "She refused it, quite forcefully." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Refused it? Why?" "She didn't give specifics," Andrew replied. "But if I may, she might see it as an insult rather than a gesture of goodwill." Jonathan rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had underestimated Sarah. She wasn't someone who could be bought or swayed by money, and in hindsight, his approach had been clumsy at best, insulting at worst. "What do you want to do now, sir?" Andrew asked cautiously. Jonathan stood, pacing the room, as he thought. "I need to talk to her," he said finally. "Face to face. No middlemen, no grand gestures. Just me." The following evening, Sarah finished her shift at Latoile, exhausted but relieved that the night had been uneventful. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her, and she wrapped her coat tighter around herself. But before she could head toward the subway, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. "Sarah," Jonathan said, his tone unusually subdued. She froze, her instincts immediately on edge. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," he said simply, taking a cautious step forward. "And to explain." She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Explain what?" "How throwing money at me is supposed to fix everything." Jonathan winced. "I deserve that. And you're right. I went about this the wrong way. But I wasn't trying to buy your forgiveness. I just wanted to help." Sarah stared at him, her expression skeptical. "Why?" "Because you were right," Jonathan admitted. "About respect, about decency. I've spent my whole life thinking money could solve everything. But after what you said, I realized how wrong I've been." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Sarah saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. He wasn't the smug, arrogant man from the restaurant anymore. He was someone who was trying. Fumbling, perhaps, but trying nonetheless. After a long pause, Sarah sighed. "If you really want help, it's going to take more than an apology or a check. It's going to take action. Real action." Jonathan nodded. "Then tell me what I can do." She studied him, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Start by listening. To people like me. To people who don't live in your world. Because until you understand what we go through, you'll never know how to make a difference." Jonathan nodded again, this time with more conviction. "I can do that." As Sarah walked away, Jonathan stood in the cold night, a sense of clarity washing over him. This wasn't just about redemption anymore. It was about transformation. And for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. Jonathan Price sat at his sprawling desk, the sleek, polished surface of his office contrasting starkly with the chaotic thoughts racing through his mind. The city skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows usually filled him with a sense of accomplishment, but today it felt distant, even irrelevant. Sarah's words from the night before rang in his ears. "Start by listening." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Listening. The concept seemed so simple, yet it felt like a monumental task. His entire life had been built on speaking, closing deals, giving orders, controlling the narrative. Listening required humility, and humility was a muscle he hadn't exercised in years. "Andrew," he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of his office. His assistant appeared almost instantly, tablet in hand. "I need you to arrange a meeting with the director of the West Side Youth Center." Andrew blinked, momentarily thrown off. "The youth center, sir?" "Yes," Jonathan replied, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "I want to visit. Personally." Andrew hesitated, but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Price. I'll make the arrangements." 2 days later, Jonathan found himself standing in front of the West Side Youth Center, a modest building with faded paint and a worn-out sign. It was worlds away from the gleaming corporate towers he was used to, but there was an energy here, a sense of purpose, that he hadn't felt in years. Linda Davis, the center's director, greeted him at the door. She was a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Mr. Price," she said, shaking his hand, "welcome to the West Side Youth Center. I have to admit, we don't often get visits from people in your position." Jonathan chuckled nervously. "I can imagine. Thank you for meeting with me." Linda nodded, leading him inside. The center was a hive of activity. Children darted through the halls, their laughter echoing off the walls. Volunteers worked tirelessly, organizing supplies and tutoring small groups of students. Despite its humble appearance, the center buzzed with life. As they walked through the building, Linda gave Jonathan a rundown of the center's operations. "We serve over 200 kids from the neighborhood," she explained. "Many of them come from low-income families, and this place is their safe haven. We provide after-school programs, meals, and mentoring, but it's a constant struggle to keep the lights on." Jonathan listened intently, his usual air of detachment replaced by genuine curiosity. He saw the cracks in the walls, the outdated equipment, the volunteers juggling multiple roles. Yet, he also saw the hope in the kids' eyes, the determination in the staff, and the resilience that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. In one of the classrooms, a group of children sat around a table, their faces lit with excitement as a volunteer helped them with an art project. Jonathan watched as a young boy proudly held up his drawing, the simple act of creating something bringing him visible joy. It was a stark reminder of the power of small moments, moments Jonathan had long taken for granted. As the tour came to an end, Linda led Jonathan into her office, a cluttered but cozy space filled with photographs and certificates. She gestured for him to sit before taking a seat behind her desk. "So, Mr. Price," she said, folding her hands, "what brings you here? And don't say it's just curiosity." Jonathan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I want to help," he said finally. "And I know that probably sounds vague or insincere, but I mean it. I've spent my life building things for myself, my business, my career, but I've realized how little I've done for anyone else. I want to change that." Linda studied him for a moment, her sharp gaze softening slightly. "Helping isn't just about writing a check, Mr. Price. It's about showing up, being consistent, and understanding the people you're trying to help." "I understand that now," Jonathan said. "I want to do more than donate. I want to learn, to be part of the solution." Linda leaned back in her chair, nodding slowly. "All right, we have a fundraiser coming up next week. It's one of our biggest events of the year, and we could use all the help we can get. Why don't you start there?" Jonathan agreed, and as he left the center that day, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what he could gain, but what he could give. Over the next week, Jonathan threw himself into preparations for the fundraiser. He worked closely with Linda and the staff, learning about the center's history and the challenges it faced. He reached out to his network, securing donations and sponsorships, but he also spent time at the center itself, getting to know the kids and volunteers. One afternoon, as he helped set up tables in the gymnasium where the event would be held, a young boy named Devin approached him. "Hey, Mr. Price," Devin said, tugging on his sleeve. "Thanks for fixing the computers. They're super cool." Jonathan smiled, crouching down to Devon's level. "You're welcome. What do you use them for?" "Games, mostly," Devon admitted with a grin. "But I'm gonna learn coding too. I want to make my own games someday." Jonathan chuckled. "That's a great goal, Devon. And you know what? I think you're going to be amazing at it." The boy beamed before running off, and Jonathan watched him go, a warmth spreading through his chest. Moments like this reminded him why he was here, why he was trying to change. On the night of the fundraiser, the gymnasium was transformed into a festive space filled with lights, music, and chatter. Donors mingled with volunteers, and the kids proudly showed off their artwork and projects. Jonathan stood near the stage, watching the scene with a mixture of pride and nervousness. He had agreed to give a speech, and while he was no stranger to public speaking, this felt different. This wasn't about business or profit, it was personal. As Linda introduced him, Jonathan took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. "My name is Jonathan Price, and I'm here tonight not as a businessman, but as someone who has learned the value of second chances." He went on to share his journey, admitting his mistakes and acknowledging the lessons he had learned from people like Sarah and the staff at the youth center. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause. Jonathan stepped off the stage, his heart pounding, but his spirits high. He had taken the first step toward redemption, and for the first time, it felt real. The echoes of applause from the fundraiser still lingered in Jonathan Price's mind as he drove home that evening. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of fulfillment that didn't stem from closing a deal or adding another zero to his bank account. The event had been a resounding success, with donations exceeding the center's expectations, and the heartfelt reactions from the attendees had struck a chord deep within him. But as the euphoria began to fade, the weight of responsibility took its place. This wasn't a one-time effort. Real change required persistence, and Jonathan was beginning to understand just how much he had to learn. The following morning, Jonathan returned to the West Side Youth Center. Despite the success of the fundraiser, the atmosphere was as busy as ever. Volunteers were organizing supplies, children were playing in the courtyard, and Linda was already buried in paperwork. Jonathan entered her office, where she greeted him with a warm but tired smile. "Back so soon?" Linda asked, raising an eyebrow. Jonathan shrugged, taking a seat across from her. "I figured I'd check in and see how things are going. The fundraiser was great, but I know that's just one piece of the puzzle." Linda nodded, setting aside a stack of grant applications. "You're right. The fundraiser gave us a much-needed boost, but there's always more to be done. The real challenge is sustaining this momentum." Jonathan leaned forward, his expression serious. "Tell me how I can help. Not just with money, but with my time, my connections, whatever you need." Linda studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. Finally, she sighed. "All right. If you're serious about this, I have a suggestion. Spend a day here, shadowing the staff and volunteers. See what we deal with on a daily basis. It'll give you a better understanding of what it takes to keep this place running." Jonathan nodded without hesitation. "Consider it done." The next day, Jonathan arrived at the center dressed in casual clothes, a far cry from his usual tailored suits. Linda paired him with Maria, a longtime volunteer who was well-versed in every aspect of the center's operations. Maria wasted no time putting him to work. "First things first," she said, handing him a clipboard. "We need to restock the pantry. The kids rely on our meal programs, and we're running low on a few essentials." Jonathan followed Maria to the pantry, where they spent the next hour taking inventory and organizing supplies. It was tedious work, but Jonathan didn't complain. He watched as Maria moved with efficiency, her dedication evident in every task she performed. After the pantry, Maria took him to the classrooms, where Jonathan helped tutor a group of children struggling with math. He was initially hesitant, unsure if he could connect with the kids, but their curiosity and enthusiasm quickly put him at ease. By the end of the session, he found himself laughing along with them, their energy contagious. As the day progressed, Jonathan saw firsthand the challenges the center faced. The outdated equipment, the limited resources, the constant need for more staff. It was stark contrast to the luxury and abundance he was accustomed to. Yet, despite the obstacles, the staff and volunteers remained unwavering in their commitment to the kids. During a break, Jonathan sat with Linda in the courtyard, sipping a cup of coffee. "I had no idea how much work goes into running a place like this," he admitted, his tone reflective. "You and your team are incredible." Linda smiled faintly. "It's not about being incredible, Jonathan. It's about doing what needs to be done. These kids deserve a chance, and we're here to make sure they get it." Jonathan nodded, his respect for Linda and the staff growing by the minute. But as much as he admired their dedication, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he wasn't doing enough. The fundraiser had been a start, but the deeper he delved into the center's operations, the more he realized the magnitude of the challenges they faced. Later that afternoon, as Jonathan helped clean up after an arts and crafts session, Linda approached him with a concerned expression. "We've got a situation," she said quietly. "What kind of situation?" Jonathan asked, immediately alert. Linda gestured for him to follow her. She led him to the main office, where a group of reporters had gathered, their cameras and microphones ready. One of the reporters stepped forward, her tone sharp. "Mr. Price, do you have a comment about the recent allegations regarding your past business practices?" Jonathan's heart sank. He had been expecting this, but the timing couldn't have been worse. "Allegations?" he echoed, keeping his tone calm despite the storm brewing inside him. The reporter nodded. "Several community centers in lower-income neighborhoods were forced to close due to the gentrification projects your company spearheaded. How do you reconcile that with your current involvement here at the West Side Youth Center?" Jonathan took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew the projects she was referring to, deals he had closed years ago without a second thought. At the time, they had been nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet, another step toward increasing his company's bottom line. But now, faced with the consequences of those actions, he felt a deep sense of regret. "I won't deny that my past decisions have had negative impacts," Jonathan said, his voice steady but tinged with remorse. "At the time, I was focused solely on profit, and I didn't consider the human cost. That was a mistake, one I take full responsibility for. My involvement here at the West Side Youth Center is part of my effort to make amends. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I'm committed to doing better moving forward." The reporters murmured among themselves, clearly surprised by his candid response. Linda, who had been standing nearby, gave him a small nod of approval. But Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. His words would be scrutinized, his actions judged. Redemption wasn't something he could achieve overnight. As the reporters left, Jonathan turned to Linda. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to bring this kind of attention to the center." Linda shook her head. "It's not about the attention, Jonathan. What matters is that you're owning up to your mistakes. That's more than most people in your position would do." Jonathan nodded, her words providing some comfort. But as he left the center that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that he still had a long way to go. He had taken steps toward redemption, but the path ahead was far from easy. And for the first time in his life, he was willing to walk it, not for himself, but for the people who needed him to do better. The weight of Jonathan Price's past loomed over him like a shadow as he returned to the West Side Youth Center the next morning. The media frenzy from the day before had left him unsettled, but he knew he couldn't let it deter him. If anything, it had reignited his determination to prove, to himself and to others, that he was capable of genuine change. The center buzzed with its usual energy as children ran through the halls, volunteers organized supplies, and staff worked tirelessly to keep everything running smoothly. Yet, there was a noticeable tension in the air. Jonathan could feel it in the way people looked at him, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. He couldn't blame them. Trust wasn't something he could demand. It was something he would have to earn. Linda Davis approached him in the main hallway, her expression calm but serious. "You're back," she said, folding her arms. "I wasn't sure if yesterday's media circus would scare you off." Jonathan shook his head. "If anything, it made me more certain that I need to be here," he replied. "I can't change what happened in the past, but I can do something about the present." Linda studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Because we've got a lot to do." She led Jonathan to the main office, where a whiteboard displayed a long list of tasks for the upcoming week. "The fundraiser gave us some breathing room," Linda explained, "but we've got to make sure those funds are used wisely. We're expanding our programs, hiring more staff, and upgrading some of our facilities. It's going to be a lot of work." Jonathan glanced at the board, his business instincts kicking in. "I can help with the logistics," he offered. "Budgeting, scheduling, finding the right vendors. I've spent my whole career managing large-scale projects." Linda raised an eyebrow. "I thought you wanted to learn, not take over." "I do," Jonathan said quickly. "But I also want to contribute in any way I can. Let me handle the things I'm good at so you can focus on the kids and the programs." Linda considered his offer before nodding. "All right, let's see what you've got." Over the next few days, Jonathan threw himself into the work. He reviewed budgets, negotiated with suppliers, and even coordinated meetings with potential partners who could provide additional support for the center. His experience in the corporate world proved invaluable, but he quickly realized that working for a cause was far more rewarding than working for profit. One afternoon, as Jonathan was reviewing a stack of proposals in the office, Sarah Michaels walked in. She had been stopping by the center more frequently since the fundraiser, helping with various tasks, and getting to know the kids. She froze for a moment when she saw Jonathan, then stepped inside with a cautious smile. "Mr. Price," she said, her tone neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Call me Jonathan," he replied, setting down the papers. "And I could say the same about you." Sarah shrugged. "Linda asked me to help with the after-school tutoring program. I figure I could spare a few hours." Jonathan gestured to the chair across from him. "You're doing more than that. From what I hear, the kids love you." Sarah hesitated before sitting down. "They're great kids," she said simply. "They deserve a chance to succeed." Jonathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's what I'm trying to do here. Give them that chance." Sarah studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. "You've changed," she said finally. "Or at least you're trying to." Jonathan smiled faintly. "I'm trying. It's not easy, though." Yesterday's reporters made sure of that. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "You can't expect everyone to forget the things you've done just because you're doing better now. Change takes time. And consistency." "I know," Jonathan admitted. "But it's hard not to feel like I'll never be able to make up for the damage I've caused." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "You won't," she said bluntly. "Not completely. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try." Jonathan nodded, her words sinking in. "Thanks, Sarah," he said quietly. "I needed to hear that." Later that day, as Jonathan worked alongside the staff to set up a new computer lab for the center, a group of kids gathered around, watching him with curiosity. One of them, a girl named Jasmine, approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Price," she said, clutching a notebook to her chest. Jonathan looked up, smiling. "Yes, Jasmine. I just wanted to say thank you for the computers," she said shyly. "I'm learning how to code now. I want to make an app to help kids like me with their homework." Jonathan's heart swelled with pride. "That's an amazing goal, Jasmine, and I have no doubt you'll make it happen." Jasmine beamed before running back to her friends, leaving Jonathan with a profound sense of purpose. Moments like these reminded him why he was here, why he was fighting to be better. But as the day came to a close, Linda approached him with a serious expression. "We need to talk," she said, leading him into her office. She handed him a folder filled with documents. "These are the applications for the grants we're submitting. They're critical for the center's future. Jonathan flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing. These are solid proposals. What's the issue? Linda sighed. The issue is that our reputation is on the line. Your involvement has brought attention to the center. Some good, some bad. If these grants fall through because of your past, it could jeopardize everything we've worked for. Jonathan felt a pang of guilt. I never meant to put the center at risk, he said quietly. I know that, Linda said, but intentions don't always outweigh consequences. You need to decide how far you're willing to go to make this right. Jonathan sat back, her words heavy in his mind. He had come so far, but the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. He realized that redemption wasn't just about doing good. It was about facing the hard truths and taking responsibility, even when it hurt. As he left the center that evening, Jonathan stood outside, looking up at the stars. The journey he had started wasn't about erasing his past. It was about building a future he could be proud of. And for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The hum of activity filled the West Side Youth Center, but today, it felt different. The energy wasn't just the usual hustle of kids running through the halls or volunteers coordinating programs. It was a celebration. Brightly colored banners hung from the walls, balloons dotted the courtyard, and the sound of laughter echoed throughout the building. Today marked the grand unveiling of the center's new facilities, a project that had been months in the making. Jonathan Price stood near the entrance, watching as families, donors, and community members gathered to see the transformation. Jonathan adjusted his tie, feeling a mix of pride and nervousness. The past months had been a whirlwind of challenges, from navigating the fallout of his past to proving his commitment to the center's future. But standing here, seeing the joy on the children's faces as they explored the new computer lab and art studio, he knew it had all been worth it. Linda Davis approached him, her smile warm but laced with the weariness of someone who had poured her heart into the project. You did good, Jonathan, she said, handing him a cup of coffee. The kids are thrilled, the community's buzzing, and for once, I feel like we might actually catch a break. Jonathan chuckled, taking a sip of the coffee. We did good, Linda. None of this would have been possible without you and the team. Linda raised an eyebrow. Flattery will get you nowhere, Price. But seriously, you've come a long way. I wasn't sure about you at first, but you've proven yourself. Jonathan's smile faltered slightly. I still have a lot to prove, he said quietly. And I'm okay with that. Across the room, Jonathan spotted Sarah Michaels talking to a group of volunteers. She had been instrumental in the project's success, lending her organizational skills and relentless energy to every step of the process. Jonathan excused himself and made his way over to her. Sarah, he said, catching her attention. Enjoying the event? She turned, her expression softening. It's incredible, she admitted. The kids are so excited, and the upgrades. It's more than I ever thought possible. Jonathan nodded. That's thanks to you. Your ideas, your input. They made all the difference. Sarah tilted her head, studying him. You really mean that, don't you? I do, Jonathan said, his voice steady. I couldn't have done this without you. Sarah smiled, a genuine warmth lighting up her face. Well, don't get used to the compliments, Price. You're still on probation in my book. Jonathan laughed, the sound light and unguarded. Fair enough. As the event continued, Jonathan took the stage for a brief speech. The room fell silent as he stepped up to the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Thank you all for being here today, he began. This center is more than just a building. It's a lifeline, a place where dreams are nurtured and futures are built. And while I stand here as someone who's contributed to this project, the real heroes are the staff, the volunteers, and most importantly, the kids who inspire us every day. The crowd erupted into applause, and Jonathan stepped back, his heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and gratitude. As he left the stage, he was approached by a young boy named Devin, who had become one of the many children he'd grown close to during his time at the center. "Mr. Price," Devon called, holding up a hand-drawn picture. "I made this for you." Jonathan knelt down, accepting the drawing. It depicted the youth center, complete with its new features, and in the corner, Devon had drawn Jonathan standing beside the kids, a big smile on his face. "Thank you, Devon," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you know." Devon grinned before running off to join his friends, leaving Jonathan staring at the drawing. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a profound weight. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged, not in the world of boardrooms and skyscrapers, but here, among people who valued compassion and community over power and wealth. As the event wound down, Sarah joined Jonathan outside, where he stood watching the last of the guests leave. The evening sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the city's lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. "You did good, Jonathan," Sarah said, echoing Linda's earlier words. Jonathan turned to her, a small smile playing on his lips. "We did good." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Sarah spoke again. "Do you think people can really change?" Jonathan's expression grew thoughtful. "I think they can, if they're willing to face their mistakes, listen to the people they've hurt, and put in the work to be better." Sarah nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Good answer." Jonathan chuckled softly, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still doubts to overcome. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. This wasn't just about redemption anymore. It was about building a legacy, one rooted in kindness and purpose. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Jonathan looked at Sarah and said, "Thank you for everything." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Don't thank me yet. There's still a lot of work to do." Jonathan smiled, the weight of her words grounding him. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Together, they turned back toward the center, ready to face whatever came next. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.